Welcome to the Mind
What do we really mean by genius?
Matters
Giftedness is so much more than an academic label.
podcast.
We tend to think of gifted as kids being good at everything across the board.
An exploration of giftedness,
Originals are nonconformists.
creativity,
People who not only have new ideas,
intelligence,
they're the people you want to bet on.
in childhood,
I like to learn about things, but I like to learn my way.
and beyond. This is the Mind Matters podcast.
Hey there, and welcome to the first episode of our second year of Mind Matters. It's mind-blowing to think that we've been doing this podcast for an entire year, but now we're back at it, and we're excited about our upcoming guests. Episode 23 is no exception, as we welcome Scott Barry Kaufman. He's a psychologist and an author, and we had a really fun conversation. If you're not familiar with Dr. Kaufman, he represents some fairly new and divergent thinking about how we define intelligence. And his research has produced some interesting results that we'll be talking about on Mind Matters today. So stay with us. We took a little bit of time off for the holidays, but we continue to stay in touch with you on social media. If you aren't already following us, please do. We love taking part in discussions online, and it's a quick, easy way to get in touch with us. We're on Twitter at Mind Matters Pod, and on Facebook and Instagram, we're Mind Matters Podcast. You'll find links, resources, and a contact page at our website, mindmatterspodcast.com. So let me take just a minute and tell you where we are with Mind Matters. My husband, Dave, is the executive producer of the podcast, and for several years, Dave and I had been searching for a way to share what we know about giftedness and twice exceptionality with more people who are looking for resources. The growth in the area of podcasting made it an obvious choice. So after some soul searching, we decided to launch Mind Matters. But I'm sure you know, podcasting is a competitive space now, and getting the attention of potential listeners is a big challenge. And once you get the listeners, the production value of our podcast has to be above average to keep them. We made a sizable investment in equipment, and combined with our monthly costs for music royalties, website maintenance, advertising, and all of the other things that go along with that, the expenses are kind of big. As we started looking for ways to defray costs, we eliminated the option of advertising. We don't want to spoil what we feel is a safe space for listeners by bombarding you with ads. It's not in our plans today, and we hope it never will be. So we decided to take a different path. We have created a way for anyone who feels compelled to chip in. To do that, we've partnered with Patreon.com, a kind of crowdsourcing website where anyone who wants to can click a few buttons and help us out. We'll have some kind of fun benefits that we'll be announcing soon for patrons, but you can feel free to check out the page right now. It's at patreon.com/mindmatters. Our intention with Patreon is to allow someone who has a little bit extra to chip in. We'll never make anyone pay for access to this podcast, ever. It'll always remain free to anyone who wants to listen. This option is only for people who are fully capable of helping and feel compelled to support us, and we're making it simple. Our donor benefits will be available to anyone contributing the minimum of $2 a month or more. I'll be honest, Mind Matters isn't just a hobby for us. We've got a lot of long-term plans to continue and grow, and we're not shying away from the challenge. So, thanks for listening. Coming up, the author of the books Ungifted, Intelligence Redefined, and Wired to Create, Unraveling the Mysteries of the Creative Mind, Scott Barry Kaufman, in a minute.
On a recent episode of Mind Matters,
Debbie Reber joins us today. Tell us a little bit about Tilt Parenting.
I created it to be kind of an online resource, an online home for parents who are raising what I call differently wired kids, being on the spectrum or having ADHD or being gifted or anxiety or sensory issues, learning differences.
Part of parenting a differently wired child is meeting them where they are, not just where you want them to be or where their neurotypical peers are.
We're in the best position to support these kids, but in order to do that, we need to deal with our own issues. We need to get clear on where we're stuck in our thinking about what's possible for our kids and who they are. And we need to figure out how to really embrace them. Then we don't have to feel so attached to the outcome or it looking a certain way. And we can really celebrate and embrace who our child is.
that's episode 15, available at mindmatterspodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, my name is Scott Barry Kaufman. I'm author of Ungifted, Intelligence Redefined. I study how all different kinds of minds can live a creative, fulfilling, and meaningful life.
Your ideas are gaining traction in the field of intelligence, and they sometimes push back against some pretty long accepted theories. What was it that led you to try and redefine intelligence, and what are you hoping to accomplish?
Sure. I mean, there are a whole bunch of experiences that I feel like came together for me in my childhood that made me want to redefine our notions of human potential. A big one was my experience in special education as a kid. I had an auditory processing disability, and I felt as though all my, certainly me, but all my classmates were really very low expectations, and it bothered me. And it really bothered me. I remember being a young kid and just thinking to myself, my gosh, like, I know my friends and I know they're capable of a lot more, and we all just sort of felt like no one believed in us. And I just was very curious. What are these individual differences? What is giftedness? I had friends. A lot of my friends were in the gifted education program. That's I remember hanging out with them in the lunchroom, and I never told them I was in special ed. And they told me, once we got to high school, they're like, "Hey, Scott, like, why don't you join us in gifted ed?" I'm like, I wish. But I had a teacher my freshman year of high school take me aside and say, why are you still here in special ed? Like, you seem like you're capable of more challenges. And that's all I needed to really inspire me to get out. And I took myself out and actually worked myself into gifted education my senior year. The gifted education teacher in my high school, out of the goodness of her heart, she let me in unofficially, undercover gifted student. And she told me at the end of graduation that I was her most gifted, not really gifted student she's ever had. Which
really does kind of make you question, like, what does that definition really mean? And I know that it's evolved a lot over time. You talk a lot about that in your book, Ungifted. What have you learned about how we conceptualize the concept of IQ? And what are some of the misconceptions that you find that other people have about cognitive ability in general?
There seems to be this rift between the scientific investigation of intelligence, human intelligence, and IQ, and school psychologists and how they're applying testing in the schools and things. It's interesting. There's misconceptions, then there's misconceptions about misconceptions. It gets very meta. I mean, I'm going to start off saying something like people wouldn't expect me to say it, and it's like people have this misconception that IQ doesn't matter, that it's like just a useless test and that it doesn't provide any useful information. And I've never argued that. That's a misconception about a misconception of what I actually argue, if that makes sense.
It does.
So I've really, in my career, I knew that if I was going to go beyond traditional markers of human intelligence, which to me seemed like the biggest marker of potential. So like ultimately I really wanted to redefine potential, not just narrowly intelligence, but I knew that if I was going to do that, you got to pick a topic in a PhD program. You can't be all over the place. So I went into the lion's den, so to speak, and I studied as traditional as you can get. I collaborated with some major IQ test constructors. We published articles showing that IQ and academic achievement are almost perfectly correlated with each other. I mean, I published things that like based on my prior experiences, like I shouldn't publish those things, right. But I really wanted to be a good scientist. A good analogy is I also was into opera, and I had to sing like the most boring, to me at least, opera arias from the 17th century Italian repertoire before I could get to the fun stuff that I really wanted to do on Broadway, Mm-hmm. So that's just my analogy to studying intelligence, is that I knew that I had to have that foundation, like that 17th century Italian repertoire, if you get what I'm saying, under my belt, so that people would take me seriously. And I kept it a secret that of my past, because I didn't want IQ researchers to perceive me any differently, knowing that, oh my gosh, I had an auditory learning disability, like that really should change anything, right? But unfortunately, labels affect how we are perceived by others. I'm trying to answer your question, believe it or not. You asked me a really good question, because I feel like in some of these kinds of interviews, like we can't really get nuanced, and I know that I can with you. I just can feel that right away. Like a lot of people ask me misconceptions and they're expecting me to say things, be anti-IQ or be anti-giftedness even. I've been in interviews where, they expect, like some uninformed educational psychologists will ask me questions, like, oh my gosh, can you believe that we have gifted education anymore in schools? I'm like, oh no, it's actually important. And they're like, what? They fall off their chair. They're like, but you wrote the book Ungifted. It's like, no. So the book Ungifted, I titled it Ungifted because that's how I felt. But I'm not saying that there's no such thing as different forms of giftedness. If anything, I've been trying to show that it's important to separate intellectual. So this is another misconception. I am answering a question, I promise. There's intellectual giftedness, which is separate from creative giftedness. There are other forms of giftedness as well. There are some people who have leadership giftedness, I think is a big one that we don't really, like future entrepreneurs and things. And so I think that, my research program, if anything, has not said that there's no such thing as like the outliers. If anything, it's trying to appreciate the outliers.
And I do understand exactly what you're talking about with kind of those layers of understanding. On the one hand, gifted education is important and it's fine. Just like traditional education is good for a majority of the students, gifted education might be good for a good portion of the kids who are identified gifted, who do okay on the IQ test, but there's still areas to improve or different ways to look at that, or like you said, other ways to be also gifted. And when I used to teach, we did some different assessments. We would assess both for achievement and for creativity, and then based on those, kids could qualify to go on to take the IQ test. And what I ended up finding is that a lot of times the kids who qualified through the IQ test but had come through that path of creativity, they ended up really struggling in our program because our program wasn't designed for that type of a learner.
Yeah, I probably would have struggled.
Yeah, it was
maybe I don't know.
Absolutely no, but because it was a very academic program, but then we're pulling in these other kids, but there's really there weren't a whole lot of other opportunities for those kids. I mean, they needed something, but what we were providing wasn't necessarily it.
As you know, a big part of my career is studying the creative mind and creative brain, and it has a different signature than the intellectual. Of course, you could be extremely high IQ and be extremely creative. Maybe that's another myth as well, is that you can't be creative if you're just have academic intelligence. That's a myth, right? You can be both, but we do find that those who are particularly divergent thinkers, they show sometimes the opposite pattern in the brain of high intellectual giftedness students, in the sense that they have reduced activation in their frontal lobes, not increased activation. The frontal lobes, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is super important for working memory, for concentration, for being able to really see what's relevant and ignore what's irrelevant. But creative students often show the opposite pattern. Creatively gifted students are able to see the things that are irrelevant to everyone else and tie it together. And when I started, all research is research. For me, all my research is research. I guess again, I shouldn't say all of it either, because I study like psychopaths, and that's not really me. I'm ravenously curious about everything, and this is part of the creative signature that I resonate with when I study the creative people. One could easily put a label of ADD on me. Easily. I'm sure that listeners of this podcast have already put that label on me. But I really am such a firm believer in looking beyond the label and looking at the humanity of these children and looking at the hidden strengths, because it is very easy to listen to my obvious paths of detours that I go on and when I answer your questions, but I hope the listener also recognizes that I synthesize and integrate it all eventually.
You mentioned labels, and I get caught in this world of, on the one hand, seeing the necessity for it, but then also being frustrated by the confines. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts and experiences in that area?
As an adult, I think we should just get rid of the labels. It serves a purpose in schools to get resources, because there are specific things in place. If you have this X label, if you have this Y label, then you are allowed to do X, Y, and Z that could be helpful to the student. So, it's like, how are you using the label, right? Are you taking that child's label and you're like imprinting it on their shirt and making them walk around school all day, wearing it? I wouldn't advocate for that. Like the label, it should not be used to reduce a child. the child doesn't even need to know their label. I think a lot of problems actually do happen all across that labeling spectrum, including gifted education. I'm not convinced it's all that healthy for the student to say that they're gifted. I mean, they can know that they're like, in a program that's fun and challenging and intellectually rewarding, but I'm not convinced it's all that helpful to the child to think of themselves as somehow more gifted than the other students in their school.
You get into the meaning of language and how does that influence perceptions. And the other component that really goes into this, the idea of labeling is also, it's really closely tied in with neurodiversity. What are your thoughts about kind of neurodiversity in general and how that ties in with both education and labels and all of those components?
The neurodiversity movement is pretty big and growing and recognizes that all sorts of minds are wired differently. It's interesting to me, though, because it's like they make a division between neurodiverse and neurotypical, and I don't know why, but at a gut level, it really rubs me the wrong way sometimes. If things go too much in the other direction and we start discriminating against people that we start labeling as neurotypical, then I get mad. It's like, no, stop that. Like, oh, you're just a typical human being. And that's not a compliment to anyone, So I go back and forth in this. I'm so weird. If we start demonizing or making fun of gifted students, I get really angry and I feel justice. But at the same time, if I start seeing gifted education students start to diminish kids in special ed, I get very mad.
Oh.
People are like, well, whose side are you on? And I'm like, I am on no side.
Or you're on all sides.
I'm on side humanity. Who's normal? Who's typical? That's my point.
Yeah, every person kind of has their own, whatever the thing it is that makes them neurodiverse.
Well, unique brain wiring. I mean, it's funny when they say like, child X has a unique brain wiring. It's like, who doesn't have a unique brain wiring? What does that mean? But, there are atypical learners in the sense that they're far beyond the pale. Mm-hmm. I could admit that. And a large part of my career has studied those individuals who are extreme outliers. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what they mean by that. And I see the value in recognizing that. But I just think we shouldn't get too hung up on that. Also, this might be a controversial thing to say, but I've noticed some students, if they're told they're so special when they're a child, they actually develop narcissism as an adult. And I think that's a topic that hasn't really been fully covered in the giftedness community as much as I would like to see it covered. Even in special ed, I think it should be discussed more in special education as well. You see a lot of students who overcompensate, Mm-hmm. They grow up and they say, I was not appreciated as a child. I'm going to dominate everyone as an adult. I'm going to show everyone how amazing I am. And that doesn't seem like the healthiest mindset either. Mm-hmm. We need to strike a balance where we apply labels for services, but we still help ground all students in special ed and gifted ed in really healthy mindsets.
I think some of those twice exceptional students as well, and the book that you edited, Twice Exceptional.
Oh, did you like it?
That's my wheelhouse. I mean, those are the kids that I work with every day. That's why I got into the field.
Yay!
Because I think people don't challenge their own beliefs. And I think that book did a great job of kind of pulling in different ways that you might not even be thinking about this.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about my path to twice exceptionality for a second. I was very resistant to it. When I was working the book Ungifted in 2011 or so, there's someone called Rebecca McMillan. She really was kind of my unofficial partner on the book Ungifted. She really helped me a lot, reading drafts. She just offered. She was just like on Facebook. She friended me and she's like, hey, can I read drafts and offer fee? I was like, sure, if you want to. And she was so helpful. She kept saying, well, you should mention the twice. I was very resistant to it. I don't know why now. Looking back, I don't understand why. I was resistant to labels. I think I was just so resistant to labels. It seemed like yet another label to me. And I wanted to, as I wrote in the book Ungifted, my purpose of this book was to peer beneath the label and look at the real cognitive mechanisms at play. And that was a big part of Ungifted. But it kept nagging at me, this because every time I started to read a description about twice exceptional, I was like, wait, that's me. I understood my childhood in a way that I never understood before. Like, it really resonated with me. It kept resonating over and over. I was like, okay, well, I need to do an academic volume on this because I'm so curious how coherent this field it really is, and whether or not we really can identify how many of these kinds of kids are out there, etc. So I rounded up I just decided. I woke up one morning, and this is how most of my projects get started, by the way. I just woke up one morning. I'm going to do this book on twice exceptional, and I just in one day sent out 60 invitations, and I was blessed to get some of the top people in the field to sign on board, and I'm pleased with the product of that book, and it has convinced me that there is something different profile.
You make an effort in the Twice Exceptional book to be inclusive with creative learners, too. The subtitle of Twice Exceptional is Supporting and Educating Bright and Creative Students with Learning Difficulties. You mentioned earlier that academic achievement and creative ability are very different processes. But can someone with a high IQ cultivate their creative side? Would you say that creativity can be learned?
You do find that people who score high on IQ are very good on on-the-spot divergent thinking tests that are timed. But the problem is that, like, over the long haul, creativity involves, it evolves and it grows, and it's a whole lifestyle. And this is what we wrote in Wired to Create, the book Wired to Create. Creative people have a lot of characteristics that go way beyond IQ that they bring to the table. I've found in my own research, openness to experience, for instance, is the number one trait correlated with IQ, correlated with creativity. So I think that, like, if we want to cultivate more creativity, I think we need to cultivate more of this kind of intellectual openness. And, part of openness to experience domain is intellect. It's actually intellect/openness. They both are part of the openness, the broader domain, which my colleagues and I have referred to as cognitive exploration. So the overall construct there is cognitive exploration, and I think that's far more important for creativity than your IQ score.
You mentioned, as you were talking, openness to experience, which is part of that big 5-factor personality model. And that makes me want to ask about your thoughts on Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration, and more specifically, that concept of overexcitabilities.
Yes, ma'am.
I kind of ask because of the parallels between the characteristics of openness to experience and the 5 types of the overexcitabilities.
Well, I love it. It's very in line with Abraham Maslow's theory of self-actualization. I think they, I don't know how much they influenced each other, but no, I love the idea of positive disintegration. I think that it needs to get more play. The overexcitabilities part is a bit corny, and I could do without it. And I know that's so controversial to say that to some people in the giftedness community, because they talk about overexcitabilities all day long. But it's I have colleagues who have empirically shown that what they're referring to as overexcitables are just different dimensions of openness to experience. It can be mapped completely into a modern. We need to update modern science. We have modern science now. So we should be talking about the modern science, not 1960, language and stuff. We have methodologies and measurements and that are reliable and valid. And if we want to be on a firm, real footing, we can just talk about the different facets of openness to experience. The overexcitability, the excitabilities thing, that whole concept, and that gifted children are more have more of these overexcitabilities. I think that because they're more intense and they feel things deeper than others. I think that's a really dangerous way of talking, because how in the world do you know if one human being feels more deeply than another human being? And furthermore, there's no research suggesting that people with higher IQ feel more deeply than people with lower IQ. There's no research showing that is the case. I have found in my own research I published in my dissertation a 0.00 repeating correlation between affective openness, AFFECTIV, affective openness, and IQ. 0. So I just want to get rid of that myth.
One of the challenges that I face when I'm working within the field of gifted education is sometimes it feels like this little bubble.
It is a bubble.
Starting my career as a teacher of gifted education and then going into kind of this field more related to psychology and then learning about the big 5-factor and talking to other people who had other knowledge bases, I realized it's there's just a better common language, I feel like, when we talk about the big 5-factor model and that openness to experience than when we talk about overexcitabilities, when people look at you and go, well, what are you talking about? They just don't know it outside of that field.
And by the way, I want to have compassion here in the sense that I get it, why a lot of parents do want to believe certain things about their children. All parents, maybe not all parents, an awful lot of parents view their children as the most special beings in the universe, right? And it's like, once they get, the gifted label, they can say like, well, they then add on like all the other characteristics. Oh yes, that explains why my son is or daughter is so caring about others and is so sensitive. The sensitivity aspect is intimately tied to the Dabrowski framework in a way that it's not tied to openness experience framework. So sensitivity and overexcitability is so popular in there. And the thing that's tricky is that even research on trying to measure the OEs has shown that really IQ is really just correlated with intellectual OE, not the other OEs. And why would we expect it any other way though? Like this is the thing that boggles my mind from a logical perspective. If all the information you have a child is their IQ score, well, there's not a shred of information gleaned from an IQ score about how deeply they feel. It's like,
oh yeah,
when you sit someone down in a sterile testing environment and ask them to come up with abstract pattern associations, like or to remove or to move around blocks on a thing, like why would we expect that to be predictive of your ability to care for others? It boggles my mind.
When I would have clients come in and they would explain away things that were very clearly issues of concern, educationally or behaviorally, because, oh no, that's just an overexcitability. Well, they can be, and that's where the twice exceptional piece comes in. It's like, well, they can be gifted and they can have this other, either diagnosis or whatever. And sometimes, like you said, whether we're looking for services at the school or perhaps medication, sometimes those labels are a necessity. And when we explain them away, I feel like a lot of times we're doing a disservice to kids who then aren't getting the help that they need.
I completely agree. You need to be very specific. You need a specific diagnosis, specific understanding of the patterns of strengths and weaknesses in an individual child to offer them the most useful intervention. To lump 14 different constructs together under the same umbrella and just call it giftedness is not helpful to any individual student. I fully believe that to be the case.
So today, everybody has the opportunity to opine about whatever they want on social media. And I did see a Twitter debate that you had about IQ with someone recently. Who was that?
Nassim Taleb.
So your position is often to question how IQ is used, but in that conversation, you were kind of put in this position of defending IQ testing. What was that all about?
I was on the train on the way back to New York, on the way to Philly, actually, with my dad, and I knocked that thread off in like 5 minutes. I was like, okay, I got to respond to this, and I just let it all out of my system. And I turned to my dad and I said, Dad, I'm the least likely person in the world to have just written a pro IQ thread defending the IQ test because I stood up against this anti-IQ individual. But what I'm really standing up for is the truth.
Right. Like, what do we really know?
I'm not pro IQ. I'm not pro anti. Like, I get mad. What fired me up is that he was saying a lot of untruths, and that upset me. It's not like I'm on team anti-IQ or team IQ. Like, you really, I hope one could never pin me down in any given moment, considering that knowledge is constantly evolving.
So, Scott, our audience includes educators, parents, counselors, and gifted people as well. What do you hope that they take away from our conversation?
I've been blessed in the past 4 years to be able to meet so many compassionate educators. I find educators, and I find in gifted education as well, some of the most compassionate, caring people you'll ever meet. I would say that science is not irrelevant, though, and I think that even sometimes our striving and our caring and our nurturing instincts towards these children should not override the search for truth. I've never quite put it that way before, but it's in answering that question, I've done so many interviews and I've said so many other things that might be more trite, like believe in your child, let your child be a self-advocate, blah 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 blah. I could repeat all those things again, and I do believe they are all true. But I thought I would take a little bit of a different answer with you in particular, because it seems to be the theme of this whole conversation. Is that in helping and empowering our children, let's also empower our children to face reality as head-on as possible. Who are they truly, not who are we as parents and teachers projecting onto our children. All these characteristics that we're projecting onto them. Let's really truly listen to them and see who they really truly are. and help them self-actualize in their own style.
Scott Barry Kaufman, author of Ungifted, Intelligence Redefined, thanks for helping launch us into year 2 of Mind Matters.
Thank you. It was delightful chatting with you.
More coming up.
The Mind Matters podcast recognizes organizations who help gifted children thrive. One of these organizations is the National Association for Gifted Children. NAGC supports those who enhance the growth and development of gifted and talented children through education, advocacy, community building, and research. We invite you to visit giftednessknowsnoboundaries.org and join NAGC's movement to see, understand, teach, and challenge gifted and talented children from all backgrounds. This is the Mind Matters podcast.
Gifted, high ability, twice exceptional, neurodiverse, differently wired. Our brains are adept at looking for patterns, categorizing, and, for better or worse, labeling. Every once in a while, we need to step back and look at our parameters. Are we on track with what we're trying to define? Our understanding and measurement of intelligence has evolved drastically over the last century. Dr. Kaufman's book, Ungifted, is part memoir, part historical analysis of how we know, and what we think we know but maybe don't, about intelligence. By continuing to question our accepted knowledge and exhibiting that openness to intellectual experience, aka intellectual overexcitability, we are able to redefine the accepted wisdom and better understand how the brains of high-ability people work and how we can meet their needs at school and at home. The field of gifted education is changing. We are aware that the methods that we've used in the past are not always in line with what we're trying to measure or look for now. Whether it's a teacher who works in a school with a large number of minority students, or a parent of a twice exceptional child who just can't seem to pass the test to qualify for services at the school, we are recognizing that in our effort to provide services to high-ability learners, there are still kids who are falling through the cracks. As we embark on our new season of Mind Matters, I hope you'll continue with us. We'll continue to explore classic topics with a new angle and depth, and possibly question some conventional wisdom in an effort to help you understand what makes this group of people tick, whether you're listening as a parent, a teacher, a spouse, or perhaps just to better understand yourself. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. Thanks for listening.
There ain't gonna be one more like you, no. Ain't gonna be one more like you, no. Ain't gonna be. I could search high and low, but I know that there ain't gonna be one more like you, no. You're my kind of one of a kind.
Thanks for listening to the Mind Matters podcast. To learn more about us and our mission, go to mindmatterspodcast.com. You can find us on Apple iTunes, Google Play, or anywhere podcasts are available. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a positive review. We're also on Twitter at Mind Matters Pod, and on Facebook and Instagram, it's Mind Matters Podcast. If you'd like to help keep us moving forward, consider making a monthly contribution at patreon.com/mindmatters. Every little bit helps. The executive producer of Mind Matters is me, Dave Morris. And on behalf of everyone here, thanks for listening.
One of a kind.
Mind Matters is a production of Morris Creative Services.